Therapists are just people at the end of the day. There's a lesson that I learned through hopefulness, and through that hopefulness, learned that, well, let me rephrase that. I was hopeful getting into the world of therapy that people who are trained to handle their emotions, or at least trained to help others handle their emotions in their relationships, and to navigate the world in a mentally healthy way. My thought was getting into this field that there would be an abundance of that. Um, just like if you're getting into the fitness world, you would assume that people, I mean, my assumption there would be I'll be around a bunch of fit people. The reality is that there's a lot of that that just isn't true. So I learned through hundreds of interactions that therapists are not better people than the average person you run into on the street. There's some generalized things, like not everyone has the ability or access to a master's degree, and it's required to be a therapist. So there are some demographical things that you can predict, and you're going to be around a bunch of university educated people with which they have statistical leanings for the type of people that they might be. But I I would say that I have been around few professional groups that are more emotionally and mentally chaotic than therapists, just to be blunt. And I struggled with this for a long time. Now, some of you, if you're watching this in Kansas City, where I'm at, you'll know what I'm talking about. But there's a very popular Facebook page here for therapists that has quite a few in it, a couple thousand. And I'd rather watch Fox and CNN for 3 hours than spend an hour on that page with how insanely vitriolic it is. So, um, in the sense that I hear more biased spewing from that channel than I do from the mainstream news outlets. It just was crazy, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why. And I think just talking with a friend of mine, not in the field, if I remember correctly, he just mentioned, he's like, yeah, they're people. And I was like, yeah, yes, they are. Now, the bias that I had was, well, trained people should be able to do their trained thing well. But then I remembered going through grad school to become a therapist, we were never trained how to handle our emotions, how to be mentally healthy, how to be good humans. We were just taught how to help other people navigate that. And I think this is one of the biggest shortfallings of the world of therapy is there's no moral or ethical direction. And I know this gets hard because what it means to be a good person has a lot of different places that we can root that in. But there's so many people that get into this field that just are not good people. And I mean that in a very uh, behavioral character way. I'm not trying to classify anyone as just you are bad, you are good. That's subjective in a lot of ways. So what I mean more by that is a lot of people who are extremely biased, despite supposedly having a space that you're supposed to be unbiased. A lot of people who are very aggressive. A lot of people who lead with their emotions in a not useful way. And, again, like I said, it surprised me for a while up until about last year, where that realization, that assisted realization that they're people at the end of the day. And which got me most of the way there. But again, if you're trained, you should be able to do something. And then it occurred to me that most therapists actually aren't trained to do that. Um, so that's a really interesting part. And I think there needs to be more room for therapists to be trained to be good people. I know a lot of the universities that exist out there, it's really hard to be terminated or expelled from them. You have to essentially break the law or threaten the safety of other people in the program or around you. When in reality, I think it's appropriate for people who are not in a good mental place to be terminated from these programs, and people who are consistently creating hostile environments to be let go. In my opinion, we're putting too many therapists out in the world who just shouldn't be therapists. And some of that might be a phase of life thing where try again in a couple years. But you think about it in the same way that any religious organization puts up leadership or any government puts up leadership. Nobody wants to go to a church with bad, unhealthy pastors. And the amount of church hurt that people talk about, this happens a lot. And nobody wants to be under a government that is unstable. And there's very few places, at least in the US, as far as I can tell, that do a good job within a select field training people up to be healthy humans as the primary thing. Are you a healthy person at the end of the day? Are you a good person more or less at the end of the day? And then with that goodness and that health, can you step into a field and do well? So, if I'm a healthy person and I'm an overall good person, that should be true regardless of what job I'm doing. And a job like mental health, I think, requires that. There are some jobs like, at the end of the day, if I have a life-threatening emergency and I need a surgeon, and I have the choice between a surgeon that's a complete jerk, awful human with a 100% success rate versus the kindest person I've ever met and they have a 50% success rate, I'm going to take the awful person to do the surgery on me. So there are some fields where I think just the job being done is, at the end of the day, the important thing. And you might argue that for all jobs, just some jobs require bedside manner to meet that standard of done well. Surgery, as long as I'm cut open, taken care of, sealed up, safe, that person, they can be a rude person. They can have awful bedside manner. A therapist, well, if they're behaving that way, there's a high chance that they're not actually going to have a higher success rate. That's true for customer service related things as well. It doesn't matter if your product's good. If you treat your customers like garbage, they don't want to be with you because that treatment is part of the service. It's not just a product, or at least you can argue it's part of the whole product. Therapy is like that as well. And some of these people who behave poorly, I fully believe that when they're doing therapy, they're not acting like that. And so there's some argument there of separating the person from the work. However, I do notice certain people, when it comes to their clinical bias, we're taught to not have a bias heading into the therapy room, which is not possible. There's a certain level of bias that's actually helpful to life. So one bias is, or assumption you could argue, is when I'm working with someone, it's good to assume that they're not going to attack me or harm me. That's a fair bias and assumption. I'm going to be biased towards people who aren't violent towards me. I'm going to come in the room with an assumption that this person wants help. If I come in with an assumption that they don't, then that's not useful. Now you could maybe argue, well, you should come in with an assumption of, I don't know what this person wants at all. Maybe. So we can kind of go in circles around this. At the end of the day, I would still argue that a completely unbiased approach is impossible. It's just not a thing. And think of any person who, let's say you specialize in couples and you've worked with 500 couples over your career, you're going to see patterns and predictions, and going in unbiased isn't possible. Now you can go in blank slate and say, typically people behave this way in couples therapy, but we're going to see how this couple behaves. Typically, couples that show contempt towards each other have one of the highest chances of divorce. Don't quote me, but something 80 to 90% chance of divorce if they're showing contempt in their behavior with each other. But that doesn't mean they'll go that way. One thing that I tell a lot of clients, I'll tell them the reason why I will treat you like an individual and not like just what the DSM says, the diagnostic book, or the data says, is because there's really no data for the most part. And I'll give you this, most of the data on any topic is a majority of the time statistic. So if you look at a study and it says this intervention has a 95% effective rate for patients, 95% of the time it works. And then this study over here replicates it 95% of the time. This study, 94%, 97%. Now there's 80 studies and all of them are 93 to 98% success rate. What that means is that that intervention works miracles. It works amazingly for people. But what's also missing is none of these studies showed 100% success. Or even if some of them did, but some didn't. There's a small percentage of people where this intervention won't be helpful. And that might be my client right now. So that's more my perspective of bias and assumption is I know it works most of the time from what I've seen. And you walk again to my room. This is fresh. So I'm going to turn off all those assumptions. They're in the back of my mind because I know they work. But first, I need to understand you. I'm not going to see, oh, your paper says you're depressed, and come in and be like, this is how you treat your depression. I just know that you mentioned to me on the phone or in your paperwork that you're experiencing a lot of depression. So I need to start from a place of human connectedness and try to learn about that depression. And if your story starts to line up more and more with what I know about depression, I'll lean it towards the going data. But it might not. And I need to go with you there instead of just say, this is your solution. Because eventually I'm going to miss some people and it's not going to be a good time for them. So a little bit of a tangent there, but I say this more as an encouragement that, the world of therapy is not full of a ton of emotionally healthy people. Now, I choose to spend my time with the emotionally healthy ones. I don't hang out with a lot of therapists. They're not my typical friend group type of people, plain and simple. I have a ton of them that I absolutely love and value them in my life. And again, not a blanket statement. And there are plenty that are very healthy. Again, my perspective is these are just people at the end of the day. And I know plenty of non therapists who are extremely healthy as well, because at the end of the day, it's not about whether you have a therapy degree. It is, are you the type of person that is choosing to be as best of a person as you can be? I'm trying to be a good person. Is that you? I'm trying to be morally and ethically right and to be a standout person and to work on my emotions and how I'm present with other people. That's what's going to set you apart. Not going to school to learn how to be a therapist. That won't do it. Um, Maybe if you find a school that really focuses on working on yourself, but bear in mind, even ones that say that they do, you still typically do that in accordance with the class that you're taking. So if that class ends and you haven't figured out how to integrate that philosophy or that theory or that thing you're working on, you're jumping right into the next thing. So there's actually a decent chance that you will have stuff that you've started to work on, it's ripped open and not sewed back up, and you have to go into the next thing. So I think some people leave therapy school and feel actually a little bit more lost or a little bit more broken down because they're beaten and not sewn back up. There's a lot of people who go into their education and therapy that are married and they get divorced during or like right after their program ends. So that's actually a lot of people. Therapists are people at the end of the day. So I just take that as an encouragement. Don't go to therapy because you think they're better people. Go there because of what they're trained to do. If you have a bad feeling about your therapist, don't book them. Don't follow through with them. Man, even if you're a couple sessions in, you're like, this just doesn't feel right, but they're trained. If that doesn't feel right thing comes from I don't know about them as a person, just follow that gut because they're people. They're not trained to be better people. They're trained to know how to do certain things. So if you're like, I don't know about this theory, I don't know about this approach, maybe push more into that with the therapist because they are, in theory, supposed to be trained to do these things. They say they are. But if you have qualms about who they are as a person and their character, trust that part of you because they have not almost certainly, I don't know of any school that does this and actively does. I think some will say they do it, but they don't. They try to throw it in, but they don't really focus on it. They're not being trained to be good people. That's their own work in their own life that does that. So trust that gut feeling if they don't feel like a great person or don't feel like a match for you, or even if they seem maybe all right, but that their personality is not going to mix with you, that's fine. Don't go see them. So that's again my encouragement and my reflection for the day is these are people at the end of the day, and I mean that in two directions. One is they're just as awful as the rest of the world, and they're just as good. So you move through and siphon through people in general, and the position they hold does not prove that. Just because someone is a therapist, just because someone's in government, just because someone's in a spiritual authority, just because someone is a kind daycare what would they? Oh, I was gonna say daycare lead. That's not right. I don't know why I'm blanking. That they take care of your kids or their teacher doesn't mean they're a good person. So, and just because they're in a field that you don't value doesn't mean they're a bad person. What it means is that there's an individual human behind that job. And the human behind the job is what decides their character. Take that for what you will. That is my musing for this week. If you're interested in therapy, reach out to me through the descriptions here. You can message me. I'm a therapist in Kansas City, technically, right now. Missouri and Kansas, I'm licensed to see anyone. If you're looking for assistance outside of that, reach out anyway, because as I said before, I know a lot of people and I can try to help get you connected with someone that might be a good fit for you. So, and if you found this helpful, it feels weird to say like, subscribe, and share, but if you find it helpful, I like doing it, and I like the idea of doing more of it. These Monday ones are fun, so are the ones throughout the rest of the week. So if you enjoy it, hit all the buttons, help it out, and I'll just look forward to seeing you all next Monday. See ya.